Hello, strangers. It's Tuesday, and it's time for another true, original story you just can't find anywhere else. I know, because I haven't told it before. This is story number 84. My name is Katie, and I'm an agnostic. An agnostic is a person who doesn't believe in God, but also doesn't believe there is not a God. Cheerful fence-sitting, I guess. But the thing about being on a fence is that either side can knock you over with a single action. And I'm not blind to signs. When I was 18, I married Kevin. Kevin came from a large and prestigious family in our small town. Kevin's family had a business that had been started by his grandfather, and all the boys worked there, interning while in college, and then coming aboard full-time for graduation. Kevin's brothers had all gone for business degrees, but Kevin was competitive. He decided to go for law and provide legal counsel to the business. Another right move in a perfect little family. Kevin's family was also very involved in our town's biggest church. Each one of them had some sort of position there. I think Kevin was a deacon. I never really understood because yours truly was not much of a church goer. And when we first started dating, neither really was Kevin. He'd laugh and chuck invitations and announcements into the trash, and insist that he'd rather spend a night eating pizza with me off the kitchen counter than go avail himself of some community potluck and have to choke down another cat hair casserole. We were a lot alike in the beginning. I was in college too. I'd discovered during high school that I really loved math and numbers, and I'd got it in my head that I wanted to go for my accounting degree. He cheered me on and I cheered him on. We'd study late nights, and while the law and accounting didn't often intersect, at least we both understood the amount of time, the stress, and the assignments. It made our early relationship really simple. But that's when the trouble started. When I went forward for my CPA certification and I graduated with my degree, Kevin failed the bar exam. I tried to be there for him, tried to be that shoulder for him to cry on, told him over and over that it had to just be nerves, had to be a fluke. Of course he'd get it the next time he took it. But sometimes I think that men get so low on themselves when they fail that there's nothing you can do to bring them out, that even mentioning the failure itself becomes problematic. So what could I do? I went out and found myself a job, just cooking the books for a local floor laminate company. Not much, but it was something. And it helped me set aside that feeling of unease that I had whenever I'd come home. Kevin would be studying, his brows furrowed, and remembering how angry he'd gotten when I tried to comfort him, even offered to go over it with him. I just avoided him. Well, Kevin took the bar, and on the second try, he passed it. For a moment, it was like I had old Kevin back. He was exuberant, excited, ecstatic. He insisted on taking us to an expensive dinner, and then on a vacation. But on that vacation, he casually mentioned that now that he could be the primary breadwinner, well, surely I wouldn't be returning to my little job when we went home. I was floored. It had never occurred to me to be a stay-at-home wife. But as Kevin explained to me, his family was traditional. His mother didn't work. None of his brothers' wives worked. He really laid it on thick, almost painting the picture that should I continue to work, it would be some slight against his ability to take care of the little woman at home. I didn't much know what to think about that, but I was so stupidly happy to have my partner back, to not have him freezing me out after he'd failed the bar exam, that I just said, well, okay, for now at least, I'll give it a try. Upon returning back to home, though, another pressure loomed. That church duty that he'd always scoffed about, well, all of a sudden, it was back in full force. He was pushing me to go every chance he could. I declined as much as I dared. I mean, I still attended on the high holies, I guess. But Kevin really started spending a lot of time at the church. He'd tell me it was for the Diamond Fellowship, taking care of all those little blue-haired ladies. Or he'd tell me it was for some new youth ministry. Well, with me balancing the books at home, it didn't take me long to figure out that what really stole his attention wasn't a ministry at the church, but a person, a nice young lady named Jessica. I didn't even have a chance to confront him with the evidence, the credit card charges that didn't make sense, the hotel charges that I called on and found aligned with his mission trips. He got her pregnant. I guess that put the fear of God into him, pun not intended, and so he came to me, eyes teary, insisting over and over that it was all a big stupid mistake, and that if I gave him another chance, he'd earn my trust back. He'd even go to counseling with me to show me how serious he was about fixing our marriage. And I said sure. I was always a sucker when he'd call me by his little pet name for me, Katybug. As for Jessica, she left the church and the town. His parents were likely involved. They had the money and the influence. But sometimes I wonder where she went. When I asked him about the counseling, that's when something else came up. See, Kevin wasn't too wild about the thought of going to a licensed medical practitioner of psychiatry. He was, of course, afraid that the shame he'd bring on his family name would spread throughout the town. Instead, he insisted that we take it slow, and at first avail ourselves of the spiritual counseling that was available at his church. They didn't have officially licensed doctors or therapists, and they were very upfront about that. But they provided guidance of a type, and one that he seemed dead set on trying. So I went along with it. I'd never gone to any sort of counseling in my life, and it seemed as viable a path as any, as long as we worked on what we needed to work on. We went. We talked. At first, her questions were all about my absence at church functions, but as soon as I laid out the real reason as to why we were there, well, we started to actually talk through that part instead. Still, one thing that did sort of nag at me was the propriety of it. After all, even with his scaled-back duties, Kevin was still a deacon, not really having been baked into the church enough to see under the crust. I still don't know if that means he was some sort of sub-pastor, or more like an elevated usher. But it did occur to me that essentially, I was talking about the inner workings of our marriage to a sort of co-worker of his. But I didn't have much time to ponder that. Once the infidelity was out on the table, that was in fact what we discussed for at least 2 sessions. But then, Kevin started to expose me as much as he'd been exposed for his cheating. He started talking about things we'd already talked over, like how I didn't contribute financially, and I wasn't interested in his faith. Now, the faith thing I side-eyed, given that I was, at that very moment, sitting in his church, talking to his choice of counselor. But I'd never stopped feeling guilty about the money thing. I agreed immediately that I ought to get a job, and I would start looking right away. What followed was a month of applying everywhere I could, all for naught. I was years from graduation. I had a single job reference. I knew it would be a challenge to break back into the working world. But in the meantime, Kevin wouldn't stop bringing it up. It really felt like he was punching down at this point, to the point where I literally built a binder full of applications and resumes that I had submitted. I brought it with me to show I wasn't taking this lightly at all. When I brought it out and began paging through it with the counselor, she suggested we start seeing her separately. We'd begun to come to the church for our marriage, but from her assessment, we both had spiritual baggage, and per her, we really needed to learn to be whole in ourselves and carry our own burdens to be evenly yoked. I agreed, completely forgetting in my guilt that this whole therapy thing was meant to be Kevin's attempt to win back my trust after cheating on me, and instead he was now using it to attack me for not having a job that I'd once had, that he had insisted I resign. I made it to all of 2 solo sessions before I figured out Kevin was cheating again. This time he'd left his laptop open on the couch in the living room. I'd heard a message alert. I went to close it, but as I glanced at the screen, another message popped up with some very tawdry language. I opened it. I scanned up and saw that another girl, this time from his family's business, was verbally reliving the last late night in detail, right down to a new use for his neckties that we'd not tried before. I bought him those neckties, I thought, as I sat there, remembering in a flash the sobbing, weeping man who'd huddled at my feet the last time he'd been caught. I thought about the heel turn in therapy that had somehow shifted the balance of our marriage failings to my column. Something cold came over me. All the wheedling thoughts, rationalizing how it took 2 to tango, they were silenced as I started hitting the screenshot button. I'd scroll, screenshot, scroll, and eventually email them to my own email address. I did remember to delete the email from his sent folder and the screenshots from his pictures gallery with a calm decisiveness I hadn't felt since taking my CPA certification. It reminded me of the person who I was, under my new identity of silly Katybug, the stay-at-home lays-about wife. I remembered who I was, a girl with a hard work ethic, a girl with a love for numbers, and a girl who, frankly, was over it. At the 3rd and final solo session with my therapist, and with my newly returned sense of self, I was having none of her pointed comments. She got in one dig as to my continued failure at finding a new job before I laid out to her that there was only one failure that was concerning, that of my husband's continued infidelity. I didn't let her get a word in edgewise. I didn't let the woman breathe. I unspooled the whole story, eyes locked on hers, daring her to try and spin this to being my fault. To her credit, she knew when she was beaten. She denounced it demurely as unfortunate. But she insisted that I take time to think on this carefully. She acknowledged, with a bit of attitude she couldn't help but let escape, that marriage was one man, one wife, one life. If I was to separate, it would cause a break that could never fully be healed back together. While I dismissed her by letting her know that was, in fact, the point of divorcing Kevin, I did agree to at least think on it before confronting him with the evidence. So I left. I drove home with no radio on. My thoughts were plenty loud enough for accompaniment, and I made it back to the house in which I could never fully feel at home. A note about this house for the rest of this to make sense. There was a small front yard, fenced in with wrought iron and ringed with hedges and shade trees that had been on the property prior to our purchase. The house had 3 brick steps up to the big front door. Beyond the door was a small hallway in which I'd installed a half table and ceramic dishes for bric-a-brac, keys, mail, that sort of thing. The hallway had 2 openings. The opening straight ahead continued into a main vestibule with a staircase, and openings into the downstairs bathroom, kitchen, and formal dining room. Off to the left of the entryway hallway, with a step down, was the den. It was plushily carpeted in white, with one entryway into the kitchen within its snowy expanse. I made my way up to the house. I let myself in, already readying my literal flail of keys and keychains for the little ceramic dish, when my body just locked up. I froze. The door glided shut behind me. It took my mind a moment to catch up to what my animal instincts already scented. Someone's here. Or had just been there. I was used to coming home before Kevin, and I'd come home to a house that had stood empty for hours. That meant I was used to a certain staleness. It's kind of how, in certain light, you can see dust flecks moving in beams of light. If you go away and let the dust settle, there's a stillness you sense upon entering the room that tells you you're alone. But what my body picked up before my brain did that night was the absence of that stillness. A presence, either right now or very recent, and I was left on high alert. Slowly, like a gazelle approaching a seemingly placid pond that may contain alligators, I crept into the hallway I'd clomped through 1,000,000 times before, eyes wide, breath locked in my chest, trying to see through and around things to find the source of this ominous feeling. As I approached the little table, my hand came up by reflex, but I stopped myself from dropping my keys and thus loudly announcing my precise location. None of this was thought out or intentional. Every action was as though my body was just doing things by itself, reverted to old lizard brain ancient instinct. Instead, I pivoted on the balls of my feet and slunk down into the sunken den, completely ignoring what the dirty soles of my shoes were doing to the white carpet that cushioned and hushed my steps. The den was empty of any burglar or intruder. The only occupants were the wall art, swans in a pond, very expensive, very boring, and a baby blue love seat and matching pair of chairs. I moved towards one of these, and slowly, carefully, began to settle my handful of keys and keychains onto one of the chair cushions. The throwback instinctual feeling was hissing. Danger, danger, slow, quiet. My hand was hurting as I began to release my death grip on my keys. I had almost, finally released the keys, when from behind me, a loud crack sounded, nearly sending me diving to the floor. A pause. I froze. Before my rational mind could catch up, came another blast of sound, a bang, followed swiftly by another through the air, with a rush of cold from behind me. Those noises were impossibly loud and punctuated with the sound of small, hard things falling to the tiled entryway floor. At this second set of sounds, my legs jolted me away, not back to the entryway, but instead to the inset door that led to the massive kitchen. That quiet hissing voice was now drumming in my head, in my heart. Run, 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 run! Through the doorway, into the kitchen, through the kitchen, banging through the kitchen door that led to the backyard. I flew, without a thought. The backyard had a deck. I cleared it in record time, and then my feet were pounding through the grass and to the end of our lot, which backed up to the backyard lots of other neighbors in our tract. From behind me, sudden squares of light flashed. They silhouetted my frenzied shadow. Someone had turned on the lights in the big vestibule. I realized in that moment I was likely highlighted perfectly. This realization lent me another burst of speed I've never had before or since, my arms and legs pistoned like machines. Further, that splash of light shoved my mind back into my head, and it started directing me consciously, not just running aimlessly into the night, but to the nearest home, its kitchen door lit, the home likely occupied. It wasn't until I was slamming my hands against this door that I realized I was still holding my keys. I couldn't breathe, let alone talk, All my air was locked in my chest, and the pressure of it and my pounding heart made it feel like I'd burst if I didn't let it out soon. When the man appeared at the door, wide eyes owlish, startled and confused, and his door swung open, I was gaping like a hooked fish. My head was screaming while my idiot tongue lay fat and asleep in my mouth, unable to explain who this crazed woman at his back door was. I swear I saw the door begin to swing shut, to secure his home from whatever in fresh hell I was, and was bringing to his literal doorstep, when a fourth sound, but now muffled by distance, sounded behind me. Like a punctured balloon, my breath and a cavalcade of words rushed out of me in a bleat that dissolved immediately into scream-crying. The man, who'd snapped his head upright at the sound and clearly knew what it was as well as I did, swiftly clasped a weathered but sturdy hand on my shoulder and pulled me inside. He cried out for Nora, his wife, who had already appeared at his side. Without a word, she pulled me into her and held me against her chest, letting me sob against her. They were older, these neighbors, and while everything in this moment felt like a surreal, gauzy blur, I can clearly remember the papery soft feeling of her hands on my back as I keened and wailed into her, and her murmured, "Shush now, you're safe, I have you," over and over in my ear. The rest of the night was off. It was like a movie where the voice acting doesn't quite sync up with the faces of the actors, coming out a bit later and registering as actual words even after. I couldn't give the police much. I assumed burglar, home invader, one of those thoughtless crimes you see on the nightly news that never happen around here until they do. But the police didn't need much from me. They'd moved through the house, and they quickly put together what had happened. Who had happened? Kevin. Kevin had left the house before me per usual, but he'd come home early that day. He'd brooded in the house, waited until he knew I'd be home soon, and then he'd made his way outside. He'd likely been hiding in the front yard, taking advantage of the privacy hedges and trees and his wife's obliviousness. In his hands, he carried one of his family's many guns. He'd had to wait so he could take advantage of Katybug, who always stopped straight in front of the door to drop her keys and kick off her shoes. He'd watched me go in, he'd waited, and then he'd fired a shot through the door. The second and third shots had also been through the door, but lower. Kevin was assuming the first shot would drop me, and shots 2 and 3 would take me out where I was, laying on the ground. The police provided pictures of the rest of his trail through the house. While they say there's no way you can know what a man's thinking, I was married to him for years. I mean, I know which side of his mouth he chewed cold food on due to sensitivity in his left molars. I knew the second I saw those pictures, like I was watching a video of it happen in real life. He'd opened the door. He'd expected to find whatever remained of me splayed out on the ground, dead or near to it. Instead, he'd found nothing save the fragments of door he'd sent flying with his shots. He'd knocked over the little table in his rush, heading directly towards the big staircase and upstairs, likely assuming I'd fled up there to put a locked bedroom or bathroom door between us. But when he found nothing, he'd come back downstairs and finally glimpsed the dirty shoe prints through the den to the kitchen and to the wide open door to the backyard. When Kevin failed the bar exam, he reacted by locking himself away and refusing to face it. When Kevin was found out for cheating on me the first time, he broke down, crying and weeping to skip any confrontation, spare the shame of his actions poisoning how highly he and everyone in his family thought of him. When he felt well clear of the impact of his sins, he'd quietly started moving the blame onto me. My not having a job when he'd pushed me not to have one, all to shift, shimmy, wriggle free and clear of any fault in himself. But here he was again, having been clearly exposed for trying to murder his wife, and his wife had got away. For the third time in my knowing him, Kevin's response to facing his consequences was to avoid it at all cost. He looked upon the prize he'd won with his actions: financial ruin, reputational destruction, prison for attempted murder. And he looked at what was in his hands and decided, let's see what's behind bullet number 4. It was a neat little parcel, all tied up, but it still felt incomplete. The question I had, and it's clear from the police questioning they had too, was why? Kevin was a ticking time bomb, but something had sparked, ignited the panic that drove a logical, considerate pillar of the community and vaunted deacon at church to think, ah yes, homicide, the best approach. Upon questioning, this came to light. His coworker, the spiritual guidance counselor at his church, she told him. She'd texted him right after our session. Her story was not because she thought he'd kill me or hurt me, but just to warn him that I was aware of affair number 2. Upon questioning, which one of the police officers explained during one of our many conversations over the next few months, the counselor had insisted she had no idea he'd turned to violence, but she was quick to remind the interrogating officers that, as she was not a formally licensed medical professional nor an ordained minister, the oath of confidentiality didn't apply. She saw herself as a family friend. A family friend. And what was I? I'd had the same last name as Kevin going on 12 years. I wasn't exactly the butler. Her prim dodging of breaking any confidentiality oath and following smugness was short-lived, though. The investigating officers requested the notes from Kevin's one-on-one sessions. With no expectation of privacy for my sessions, as she was so quick to raise, the church couldn't object to sharing his. They reluctantly forked them over, and through them, I was shocked to learn more about the man I'd slept next to and with for over a decade. He'd not smashed any vases or punched holes in any drywall, but his words were violent enough. He spoke of harm to befall me, the suddenly appointed cause of all of his ills. The notes started with when he'd failed the bar. He painted me out to not be considerate, compassionate, and in his corner, but taunting him with my successes. All of his failures he narrated, doctored, timed, to coincide with my successes. Left out were, of course, the many times I tried to comfort, console, and help him. He relabeled my care and love as passive-aggressiveness and spoke of having to escape by taking refuge in his office, in his church, and later in the arms of a woman, and then another. He even let slip the real reason I'd had such trouble getting hired. He'd called around, and with his name and prestige and persuasion that his wife was just playing about, if she didn't get the job, she'd understand her place. Well, the people he contacted buried my applications. For him, it was all about his legacy, his family name, and his image. And when he got that text, letting him know I had the ability to impugn his credibility again with a fresh new affair and piping hot screenshots, well, the dominoes began to fall. Of course, being a 60-year-old church lady with no priors, the counselor escaped any sort of indictment. But the church was quick to disavow her, and as I learned from her hesitant contact, they retooled their entire counseling ministry. They also quietly offered a large check to get my signature on an NDA. While the irony was almost too rich to bear, a man had nearly killed his wife over fear of a damaged reputation, and they came wanting an NDA for the same concern. I faced facts. I was near 30. I had a nearly blank job history and a desperate need to get the hell out of Dodge. I took the money, and I bet you'd take it too. I don't know if there's a moral to any of this. I don't know that any more than I know there's a God looking down on us, his weird little creations in the daycare of Earth. I know something other than me was on my side, though. It told me to be still, quiet, cautious. It told me to run like my life depended on it. And it led me straight to two people that took me in and held me while the final bullet cracked through the air. Was it evolution or something more divine? God of Abraham or Tawanda, the avenger of all women? What I do know is that I'm alive, and he's not. And sometimes, the conclusion of the story is all you get. And that was story number 84. If you liked it, if you hated it, or if you want to share something of your own, email and comments are available. Socials are also in the description, in the event that any of you care to see the weird things I find on Instagram. Liking and subscribing always appreciated, but never required. And until next time, stay strange, stay safe, and take care, strangers.